episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy. As always, I'm your host, Killian, managing editor for Being Libertarian, LLC. Just before I get into the full episode today, which kind of is a part of the episode, one thing I wanted to say was definitely wanted to give a big thanks to a lot of the followers I have on my personal author page, and also the followers that go along with the page Being Libertarian there, because recently a person I know inside the Liberty Movement had fallen on some hard times and needed some assistance to kind of make through the little rough patch. Within half a day of what we thought was going to be about a week-long fundraiser to try and help him get everything set out, we were able to get it all wrapped up. He was, I think, $500 or $600 over his goal at the last time I checked. Not a massive amount of money was needed, but it's one of those cases where the right person needs it at the right time. And that little amount can be exactly what you need to just kind of make rent and make it through that rough patch to the next phase in your life. He's kind of in a transition period from things that have kind of gone and happened in his life there. But definitely wanted to give a big thank you to everyone that donated to the cause there to help him out. Great person in the movement, and also always great to see that kind of voluntarism actually happening. I want to try to avoid the tagline voluntarism in action, because that's a charity page that's slightly associated with some of the works that we do with Being Libertarian there. But if you're looking to find different causes or different types of charitable action where you're able to directly help people, I definitely recommend checking out the page Voluntarism in Action. They have tons of different campaigns that they'll put on where your donations can end up going directly to the person. So it's not like a lot of different charity groups where, you donate $100 and maybe 5 of it actually makes its way towards the people in need. It's all just a page using its reach to get potential donors in front of people in need. They do some great work. I think last year, don't quote me on this number, but I think the last year they did something in and around a little over $100,000 in charity, just by putting the causes in front of the right people and letting people do what they do best and help each other out. That sort of links into what I wanted to talk about today as well, which is the concept of voluntarism in action. And again, the page uses that as a concept of just charity itself, but I wanted to talk about the actual idea of being voluntary in your actions. So the actual idea of trying to set things up and trying to be organized in such a way that your relationships are based on voluntary means. I'll give you a couple examples here. So, for example, if you go to a grocery store, you buy your food, everything else, that can be just considered a voluntary transaction. You chose to go to the store, you chose to buy what was available. They, chose to accept your business, take the money, quick in and out, you're done. So when a lot of people think of like something being voluntary, they think in very simple transactions like that. But it misses a lot of finer details. And these are just some things that I'm not going to make a very long episode about it, at least not at this point. It's definitely something I'm going to come back to kind of really dig in on, but I just want to use this as kind of a buffer to the idea, if you will. But when we're talking about a truly voluntary action, one of the ideas that needs to be addressed with that is what makes an action voluntary. Now, you go probably basic dictionary definition of it is, a voluntary transaction is just a transaction where all the parties involved aren't under any type of duress or coercion. Now, that sounds pretty straightforward until we start thinking about, what can lead to duress? What can lead to coercion? What can be problems in this? I always liked I always liked Hayek's example of this. I know Rothbard had his problems with this potential argument, but shelving those for a second because I still see the validity in them. I always liked Hayek's argument with the nagging wife. So it's the idea that you're not under direct threat of violence, but because of the just emotional drainage and different things like that comes from the wife nagging at you to take the garbage out or something like that, it still works out that you're under a form of duress. You are not making an entirely voluntary action. You are being coerced into whichever mundane list of chores that she had prepared for you. A lot of other people will take coercion to strictly mean some sort of situation that makes it completely involuntary, usually the use of force or the threat of the use of force that results in a person having to take a certain course of action. I find this one interesting because they include the threat of force. Now, actual force, 100% makes perfect sense to call that a form of coercion, because if they're literally, grabbing your arms and forcing you to, put your debit card in a machine and hand over money or anything like that, like if they're literally mugging you, that makes sense to call it coercion. But I do find it interesting that threat of violence is considered coercion, and however, the more common and mundane forms of coercion are not. So, someone threatening to harm you, well, you still have the choice to call their bluff on the threat and still proceed the way you choose to proceed, or taking that information in, choosing to follow along with what they suggest. Same thing with going back to the nagging wife example. You can choose not to follow the directions. You can choose to completely ignore it or do something to the opposite effect. But the fallout is going to hurt. The fallout is going, not necessarily physically damaging like a threat of violence, but from a mental health perspective or from an emotional perspective, sometimes those types of fallouts can be as much, if not more, damaging, which then, of course, leads you to trying to consider what you would consider a proper form of coercion. Realistically, we take a look at, I'll do a flip side on this, take a look at advertising and marketing, or even just general salesmanship. Advertisements, marketing, salesmanship, all that stuff is a form of manipulation. Now, not necessarily negative manipulation. The term manipulation, or the idea of being manipulative, is by default considered a negative thing, when in reality it's not. You can manipulate someone into actually going and exercising and trying to better their lives. Life coaches, the entire industry of life coaches is based on one person standing beside another person and finding different ways to manipulate them into doing positive actions for themselves that they wouldn't otherwise undertake on their own. Advertisements, marketing, salesmanship, it's the same kind of manipulation, which in turn means that they are finding ways to not necessarily force you in a certain direction, but they're presenting things in such a way that it seems like you don't have a choice. One thing that you see, and you'll see salesmen use this tactic often, is salesmen will go through the math or fluff up the numbers and try to present it in such a way that one option is almost infinitely more appealing than another option. This is something that I've heard referred to. I don't know if there's an official term for it, but I've seen it referred to as either an alternative close or a closed matrix presentation. Closed matrix because, yes, there's tons of different options you could take in the middle, but the end result is going to come down to one of two choices, and they've already kind of decided which choice you're making for you. Railroading you without railroading you, basically. Illusion of choice. So this is when they give you the option of, you can take the car, this offer on the car that's, $6,000 off, and then you got another $3,000 deductible, and we're throwing $3,000 worth of features in, and it's this massive deal. Or you could take the other car that we were looking at there, where you save about $500 and it's going to cost you $8,000 more. Which one would you like? At that point, it becomes what you would consider a no-brainer to go with the first option. A lot of the times, those kinds of situations where they're quote-unquote no-brainers are situations where you've been just led to that result. It's what the salesman wanted you to take, in which case they present it in such a way that you really don't have a choice in going with another option without choosing to sacrifice, large quantities of money or whatever else have you. The reason I mention that is because I wouldn't consider, and most people wouldn't consider that to truly be a form of coercion. But then, of course, we have to ask ourselves, if the far end of the spectrum is physical violence and the short end of the spectrum, we have the potential toll from the nagging wife. How far can we dilute the idea of a course of action to where we have to say, well, no, they're just kind of, there's a difference between someone trying to make a case for something and someone being manipulative. There's a difference between someone trying to force you into doing something versus someone just appealing to you to do something. But even then, every time someone appeals to you, they're trying to get you to go in their direction. They're trying to make you take the course of action that they want you to take. And if they have, let's say they're equipped with a certain set of, they're equipped with those types of skills, either negotiating skills or just argumentative skills, where they might be better equipped to be able to direct you to the point where the fallout from choosing this other choice that they've created for you, which normally is a false dilemma, but that's beside the point, where they try to put you in that type of situation making the choice, they set it up in such a way that you can't really say no because of what it would mean if you said no. It would mean you're that kind of guy that turns down, a $12,000 off offer on a brand new vehicle because the salesman said that they're stacking a whole bunch of offers for you. You're the guy that ignores his wife's needs and doesn't do basic things around the house. You're the guy that likes to get the living shit beat out of you because you decided to ignore the physical violence or threat of physical violence and just roll with it. And hey, nothing wrong with the people in the latter category, just as long as you got a nice safe word. But anyway, when it comes to all of that, what I find interesting with that kind of sliding scale is that nobody talks about how we can try to define it for society at large. And then from there, actually define what we want as a voluntary society. So if we can't define what makes an action involuntary, if we're considering coercion one of the bases of an action not being done entirely through voluntary means, then until we can define that coercion, we can't really claim that what we do at any given point is voluntary. And that's just the coercion aspect of it. I mean, we could take the long way around it and start bringing up a whole bunch of neuroscientists and existential philosophers and start asking about how the mind and the self works. We can even bring up the classic free will debate if we really want to talk about whether any actions are truly voluntary, because that would require the concept of free will in order for us to have a truly voluntary self-driven action. But generally when we're discussing these terms, that's a can of worms that doesn't really quite apply, because, and this is something that slightly sidebar, but this is something that aggravates me a lot when I see it in debates, is people getting lost in the terminology of their debate rather than actually addressing the central points of it. I see this a lot in debates with certain terms like self-ownership. Self-ownership's a really heated debate for that one once you get into the idea of the terminology itself, because one of the key aspects of property is that it's A, external, and B, transferable as a standard concept of property if you have true ownership of property. But self-ownership, you can't transfer the self. Then you get into what is self, and the whole thing devolves pretty quickly, despite the fact that people who are aware of the idea usually understand the idea and tend to agree with it, tend to agree with the idea that you have a mastery of yourself. And again, until you get really out into the weeds with some of that stuff, if you understand the basic idea of what you're discussing, at that point, you really need to go out in the weeds to try to tweak the language? Not really. In this case, though, when we're trying to define voluntarism and things like that, it does take a certain level of defining, because we have to say, okay, so what is an acceptable amount of manipulation? Is having asymmetrical information in negotiations. Does that mean that someone has the power over the other person in that regard? In which case you could call it a form of coercion, them wielding that information against the other person? Probably not. But it's still they're still not making a completely informed decision. In which case, if they don't have all the information, they could very easily be railroaded into making a poor decision. They could be manipulated into it and still look, for all intents and purposes, like a voluntary action. For myself, I find that the easiest way to define a voluntary action is when someone's able to take a look at a scenario, then make an active choice about how they proceed. Now, sometimes, yes, there's going to be debates, there's going to be back and forths. I have a sales background myself, and I consider it just that, is there going to be manipulations and things like that? Yes. Are you going to see asymmetrical information? Yes. While there's not always a physical toll, are there going to be certain decisions that are made where there's going to be a emotional toll or a mental health toll or anything like that that's a component of it? Yes. Are there people that are going to know this and try to use it against you to make you go the way that they want you to? Yes. But we always retain the ability to take a step back and decide for ourselves the way we want to go. I mean, even people that are under threat of violence can still choose to call that bluff, or even might welcome the punishment that comes for not following the original directive, because the choice itself is worth that much more. I mean, you see this with, I know everyone's going to throw the ACAB out there, but I mean, you do see this with the odd case of a police officer that turns in their fellow cops. You do see this with, people who decide to rat out on mafias and go into witness protection and all that. They do that under threat of, they know that that there's a good chance that they're going to die if they do this. But they do it anyway because for one reason or another, either they've been coerced into doing it themselves, or like from a different type of coercion, they'll take the risk of the mob killing them over the risk of getting thrown in the slammer with from the FBI or from the RCMP or from whatever your federal government is in whichever country you are when you're listening to this. They'll take that one risk over the other risk, which is another aspect to get into, but I'll touch on that in a few minutes. My point with this is that so long as you, as a person, retain your ability to step back and make that choice, we can say that it's a form of voluntary action. It goes back to, I guess it's a rather, not necessarily fatalist, but I think that's the best word to use in absence of a better one at the moment, view of differences between wants and needs. A lot of people will say, oh, well, food is a need. Well, not really. And I say not really because food's not a need, air is not a need. These are things we need if we want to continue to live. But then again, that requires us to want to continue to live. And I'm 100% not advocate suicide, against suicide. If you're having those types of feelings, reach out to somebody, talk to them, do whatever you need to do to kind of reaffirm the importance of your own life. Usually find when people are in those low points, they ignore a lot of the finer points in the world, in which case even just taking a step back, putting things off and talking to a few people, they'll be able to turn that around. My point, though, like I said, is that with that, you get to the point where wanting to live is a want. There is no ultimate universal need for that to persist, if we're talking grand scheme of things here. So even when we think of things that could make an action involuntary, well, if someone's, threatening to kill you unless you do such and such an action, you can choose to accept that death in place of following along with what they say. I mean, that's why we have martyrs. That's why we have, Gandhi's a good example. Gandhi knew that he was going to starve and die if he kept up his hunger strike. But even knowing that that was looming over him, he still chose to persist. A lot of the people in the civil rights movement knew that if they didn't have a high profile on them, or if they were, quote unquote, lower or middle of the pack when it came to the civil rights movement, that there was a good chance some good old boys were going to take them around into a, dark stretch of the woods, and they weren't going to be coming back. Despite the threat of that, they still chose to persist. So that leaves us back at square one. What makes an action coercive and what makes an action voluntary? Like I said, I define it as retaining the ability to take a step back and still make a choice. An action's voluntary so long as you have the ability to actually say, you know what, this is the route that I want to go. In which case, we already have a voluntary system. Now, there's some things that aren't voluntary. I mean, for example, taxes are not voluntary at the end of the day. Now, you can choose to pay the taxes. Your employer can choose to pay the taxes, so on and so forth, right up until the point where you choose not to. And if you choose not to, it seems like, that's one of those cases of, under threat, such and such is going to happen. Eventually down the road, they will throw you in prison, freeze your accounts, and just simply withdraw all the money they want. Or throw fines at you and find ways to forcibly take that money off of you where you don't actually even get a say in the matter. We see that a lot with, we see that that's one of those aspects that you can't really control because they have the ability to go past your choices and simply make something happen. We see a lot of that with public education. Now, granted, it's a choice to enroll your child in regular schooling versus going through the process to go public schooling, which can definitely advocate for and say that sometimes homeschooling is a far better choice. But if your child's in a public school setting, you don't really get a say on what they're taught. You're not voluntarily choosing how they're being educated. Which brings another aspect in of how granular does the decision need to be for it to still be voluntary? Do you just have to be voluntary in the broad scheme of things, or does it have to actually get to a very to the point breakdown? For myself, I find that the best way to really answer any of these questions is to not try to answer them. I know that sounds pretty, that sounds like a bit of a cop-out for sure. But realistically, my opinion of where these lines could be drawn are going to be very different from where any of your opinions are likely to be drawn. We could take any 10 people that are listening to this, and they're all going to have different ideas of where the lines can be drawn, what is coercion, what is not coercion, what is, what could invalidate a free choice, and what truly is a voluntary choice. And that's the beauty of it, is that like a lot of things, especially if we're talking about, minimalistic government or no government, a lot of those choices need to be made by the communities themselves. So you see this, I'm going to quote Hayek again here with his social evolution of rights, where he talks about how certain things become societal norms simply because societies grow, evolve, change, and adapt these ideas, these social constructs, as pillars for their community. The idea of what is and is not voluntary, the idea of what makes things voluntary, those are going to shift based on what types of actions are considered acceptable in a given society. If a society considers that it is acceptable to have asymmetrical negotiations, and they don't consider that, a power struggle or anything like that, similar to most sales discussions we have today, it's not something that comes up where people automatically assume that they don't actually have a choice in the matter when it comes to dealing with salesmen. Most people usually think quite the opposite. They think they hold all the cards in that, rather than it being more of a 50-50 relationship. Our society works with that. A lot of others might not. I'll use one more example here. Again, when it comes to the coercion thing, you can see that even when you split between Hayek and Rothbard. Hayek believed that having some form of emotional coercion or coercion by alternative negative effect, such as the nagging wife syndrome that's used there, he believed that is a valid form of coercion. Rothbard in Ethics of Liberty, in his little takedown chapter on Hayek, goes in. He doesn't really go in. He quotes a different professor and mainly just frames most of that guy's arguments, but that's beside the point. Goes in that that's not truly coercion because you can choose to accept that other negative result. As if choosing the negative result of physical harm is any different. Don't quite get that one, but let's say that that's where people draw the line, is that it's only truly involuntary if there's an actual threat to your person involved. That's a different standard and a different community at that point. And because you can have these differences in beliefs that no matter how much you argue, no matter how detailed your analysis of the situation or idea could be, a lot of it at the end of the day, when we're getting into the actual practice of it, is going to boil down to personal choices becoming group norms. A lot of trial and error until different communities and different groups just adapt different customs for it. That's how most customs and cultures evolve, is through the small, slow building up of these different, I guess you could say, almost personality quirks. It's probably the best way to describe it. We get to those decisions as a group just through the trial and error of deciding what does and does not work for us, what we will accept, what we will not accept. Ultimately, though, having voluntary actions, no matter how we define them, is something that we should be aiming for. We should be aiming to have it where people don't feel the need to go along with some current pre-established norm. They don't feel the need to be bound in any way, and they should not have any group, government or otherwise, putting a barrel of a gun to the back of their head in order to make them to comply with whatever whim of their will has propped up, since the election season. I also like the idea of voluntarism just in general for problem solving. It's a lot better to be the direct change than it is to appeal some other group to be the change for you. We see this in the charity versus welfare debate quite often, which, if you haven't been able to guess, I lean quite heavily on the side of charity in that one. Because again, it's at that point showing that you personally want to see this happen. Ergo, you are taking that action. You are going to voluntarily assist in making this happen. Or sometimes you're going to volunteer, literally. My end point with all this, I guess, is that when we take a look at some of these cornerstone ideas, because really, if we're ever going to have a truly free society, these are ideas in a free society that we're going to need to discuss more. And we're going to need to try and hit a balance point on, or hit an understanding on, that we can all function from. We can, talk to the ills of the government for days on end and throw economic theory around, but if we can't agree on small things like this, which are really large things in disguise, it's going to be very difficult ideologically, culturally, socially, etc., to get society to really function in a voluntary way. Food for thought for everyone that's out there thinking and wanting that type of future, that maybe we need to define it a little more. A little more defined it gets, a little more specific our arguments get on it, a little bit easier it gets for us to get from where we are now to there. Goals are always easier to reach when you've got a clear one in mind. So actually helping to define that and understanding why we define it that way is a massive step forward in being able to reach it. So that's about everything I got for you today. I'm just going to wrap up here. If you're not already, do please follow my author page there, Killian Hobbs Author. I post a bunch of memes, puns, links to different things that are interesting, sometimes political commentary, so on and so forth. It's also the easiest way to reach out to me if you have any ideas for guests for the show, or if you have ideas for the show itself, or questions about any of the articles that I've written or anything like that. You can just message the page directly. I'm usually pretty quick to respond. Otherwise, if you liked what you heard and you'd like to hear more, I'll see you again next week.